Hi, I'm Claire Ridgway, creator of the Anne Boleyn Files website and also author of several Tudor history books, including The Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn, the Earl and Countess of Wiltshire and the parents of Queen Anne Boleyn, and also Mary Boleyn and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Now, over the past few decades, Queen Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary Boleyn, and recently George Boleyn, have largely been rehabilitated, with historians and authors challenging the old myths, successfully challenging them on the whole, although, we sometimes still get the myths surrounding particularly George Boleyn and his wife Jane, but on the whole they're being rehabilitated. But sometimes the rehabilitation of the girls of Anne and Mary has been at the cost of their parents' reputation. Sometimes we see, Anne and Mary being rehabilitated by them being seen as pawns of their family, as chattels used to promote the family's interests at court, as stepping stones for the Boleyns' success, as tools to get the family close to the crown, close to Henry VIII. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's brother, the Duke of Norfolk, as pimping the girls out to the king. But there is, however, little evidence for this depiction of the Boleyn family for Thomas and Elizabeth, and also the Duke of Norfolk. So often we see, especially in fiction and movies and TV series, we see a very weak Thomas Boleyn. He's there plotting with his wife, his cold and calculating wife, and his brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk. They're plotting to advance the interests of the Boleyns and the Howards at court by throwing Mary and Anne at the king. We're led to believe that Thomas Boleyn only advanced at court because the king was rewarding him, paying him for the use of his daughters, for allowing him to bed his daughters. We're even led to believe by some that Elizabeth Boleyn slept with the king as well, so here we go, Thomas being this really weak character that has to use the women in his life to advance at court for his own ambitions. Wow, Thomas Boleyn really was something, wasn't he, if you see that kind of side of him. And then Elizabeth, how cold and calculating can you be to be a mother who lets, a king do that to your daughters and who lets your husband do that to your daughters? Wow, she really must have been something as well. She mustn't have cared about her daughters at all, or her son George for that matter. Yes, Thomas Boleyn really was something. He was a hard-working and gifted man. We know that from the records of the time. He had absolutely no need to pimp out his daughters to the king to rise at court. In fact, he was already a royal favourite, a servant to the crown, before either of his daughters got involved with the king. Thomas Boleyn's rise at court was down to his abilities and his loyalty as a servant to the king. Now, we don't actually know when Mary Boleyn had a sexual relationship with the king. Her relationship with the king is commonly dated to Shrovetide 1522 because King Henry VIII rode out to the special Shrovetide joust on Shrove Tuesday with the motto Elle mon cœur a nevera, or she has wounded my heart. With the trappings of his horse had a picture of a wounded heart, and that was the kind of the theme of the joust. His heart was wounded by this woman. But he didn't go out declaring that that was Mary Boleyn. There's nothing in the records linking this motto and the theme of the Shrovetide celebrations to Mary Boleyn. We cannot know who has wounded his heart or who the king was attempting to woo at that time. But it's always assumed it was Mary Boleyn. It always appears in books, in fiction, that this was when Mary Boleyn was having a relationship with the king. It's also dated to around this time because Mary Boleyn had married William Carey back in 1520, and he was being given royal grants and offices from this time on. But it's a leap to suggest that the king was rewarding William Carey for the use of his wife. Carey was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. He was also related to King Henry VIII. And actually King Henry VIII, I mean, we always think of him as this tyrant and this monster. But actually Henry VIII was a very generous man to those who served him. And he was incredibly generous to members of his Privy Chamber. If you look through the grants, you get lists of grants in letters and papers. And if you look through these lists of grants and offices that are given out, you will find the same names coming up over and over again. And they're loyal servants to the king, and they're being rewarded for their loyal service. And Carey is no different. I mean, it's making a leap, in my opinion, to say, oh, he's being rewarded for giving his wife to the king, for letting the king use his wife. I would suggest that it is more likely that Mary was involved with the king before her marriage. She married Carey in February 1520. I believe that the king slept with her at some point. We don't know how many times he slept with her, only that he had a sexual relationship with her at one point. He slept with her and then organised a marriage to a member of his Privy Chamber when he had tired of her. This kind of makes more sense to me because this is what happened with Elizabeth Blunt, Bessie Blunt, who was, the king's mistress. We know she was the king's mistress. She had the king's son, Henry Fitzroy. He organised a marriage for her after, he had finished with her. So I kind of think that was sort of Henry's MO, really. It's how he kind of did things. So for me, it makes more sense that Mary slept with the king, perhaps 1519, early 1520, and then he organised a marriage, which was a good marriage for her, to William Carey, one of his Privy Chamber, and a relative to the king, and the king actually attended the marriage as well. By the time of her marriage, her father was already a royal favourite. So by the time that Mary is likely to have slept with the king, her father was already a royal favourite, and he cannot be seen to have pimped her out just to sort of rise at court. Here are just a few of his career highlights. I go into more detail on Thomas in my book, The Anne Boleyn Collection 2, and also articles on the Anne Boleyn Files website. But this just gives you an idea of his early career. 1501, he was present at Catherine of Aragon's wedding to Prince Arthur. That was in Henry VII's reign. In 1503, he was chosen as one of the party to escort Henry VII's eldest daughter, Margaret Tudor, to Scotland to marry King James IV. He was appointed an esquire of the body before Henry VII's death, and he was actually kept on by the new king, Henry VIII, when he came to the throne in 1509. So, we're here in the early 1500s before, his daughters became involved in the king when they were children. He was knighted by King Henry VIII in 1509, and his wife Elizabeth served as one of the baronesses of the Queen's Chamber at the coronation of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon in 1509. In 1510 and 1511, he participated in court revels and royal jousts. He was involved in the joust to celebrate the birth of Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, the son of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, who only lived 52 days. He was a chief mourner and one of the night bearers at Prince Henry's funeral on the 27th of February 1511. 1512 to 1513, he was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria with John Young and Sir Robert Wingfield to act as an envoy to her father, Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, to conclude an alliance between England and the Empire against France. So that was a really important job. And he actually became very good friends with Margaret of Austria, became close to her, and that enabled him to get his daughter Anne to go to Margaret of Austria's court. By 1514, he owned or had been granted a controlling interest in around 20 manors. He was the keeper of various estates. He was the keeper of the exchange at Calais and the foreign exchange in all English ports. So, very important. 1514, he managed to secure places for both of his daughters, Mary and Anne, in the entourage of Mary Tudor, who was going to France to marry King Louis. In 1516, he acted as a canopy bearer at the christening of Princess Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. A year later, 1517, he acted as Queen Margaret of Scotland's official carver for her 40-day visit to England. 1518, he was a member of the Privy Council by this time, and he was involved in the negotiations for the Treaty of Universal Peace that was signed that October. And then we come to 1518, 1519. He was appointed as the English ambassador to the French court. What an amazing career for this man. And I could go on and on and on. Obviously, he continued to rise because he was on the up. From 1501, when he was at the wedding of Catherine of Aragon and Arthur of Tudor, this man was a royal favourite. He had absolutely no need to throw his daughters at the king. I hope you get the picture. He went on to receive more grants, offices and titles, but these are more likely, surely, to have been rewards for his loyal service, for his diplomatic dealings, for his loyal service to the king, for the stuff that he did, for his gifts, his talents. Now, rather than pushing his daughters at the king and pimping them out, Thomas actually may have been unhappy and concerned about the king's interest in them. The fact that the king had to intervene for Mary Boleyn when her husband died of sweating sickness in 1528 to get her father to help her financially could suggest that there's some kind of a breakdown in the relationship between Thomas and his daughter. We don't know. But it just seems a little bit weird that Mary had to go to the king to get her father to help her. She must have already tried going directly to her father. So could it be that he distanced himself from Mary when perhaps he felt that she'd tarnished her reputation? That's speculation. Then we have the words of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. He wrote about Anne Boleyn's relationship with the king in 1533. He hadn't heard yet that Anne Boleyn and the king had married in January 1533. That news hadn't sort of got around when he wrote this in the February. I must add that the said Earl of Wiltshire, i.e. Thomas Boleyn, has never declared himself up to this moment. On the contrary, he has hitherto, as the Duke of Norfolk has frequently told me, tried to dissuade the king rather than otherwise from the marriage. So Chapuis is clearly saying there that the Earl of Wiltshire, Thomas Boleyn, has tried to dissuade the king rather than promote the marriage. That doesn't sound like a man who is, forcing his daughter on the king. In May 1533, Chapuis wrote of Anne Boleyn's indignation at her father and uncle's opposition to her marriage. She was unhappy that her uncle and her father weren't supporting her marriage to the king. So that seems to me to be clear evidence of the men's concern about the situation, rather than them being the ambitious men that we see in fiction and TV of plotting to get Anne to marry the king and doing everything in their power to get her the crown. But what about Elizabeth Boleyn? Well, she tends to be a more shadowy figure. She seems to always be sort of presented as a woman who actually didn't have much to do with her children, or as a woman who sort of is callously throwing them at the king along with her brother and her husband. Well, what we do know about Elizabeth is that she acted as a chaperone when King Henry VIII was courting her daughter Anne. She was with Anne at various times. We know that she went on a visit with the king and Anne to see York Place, which became known as Whitehall, after the king took it from Cardinal Wolsey. And when Anne and the king were looking at the property to see what they could do to it, their sort of renovation plans and that, she, according to the records, went with them. She was chaperoning Anne. We also know that she lodged with Anne at York Place in 1530, that they were given accommodation there, mother and daughter. In a letter to her friend Lady Wingfield in 1531, Anne wrote of her love for her mother. She wrote that her love for Lady Wingfield, could only be sort of compared to, her great love for her mother. When she was arrested in May 1536, Anne Boleyn wrote of her concern for her mother. She wrote of her worry about what the news of her arrest would do to her mother. This speaks of closeness and love, not a distant relationship between mother and daughter. As for the idea that Elizabeth Boleyn slept with the king, well, when Henry VIII was accused of meddling with Anne Boleyn's mother and sister, he replied, "Never with the mother," and there is no evidence at all that Elizabeth was unfaithful to her husband with any man, never mind the king. But what about the events of 1536, the events of those bloody days, as Thomas Wyatt called them? How could loving parents let their son George and their daughter Anne die like that without trying to stop the events, without trying to stop their execution? How could Thomas Boleyn carry on serving the king the way he did? Surely that is evidence that ambition won out and that he didn't care one iota about his children. Well, that would be judging the Boleyns with our modern values and taking them completely out of their 16th century context, taking them out of court life. But the Boleyns are not like modern day parents. To judge them like that is to just forget their context. We don't know if the Boleyns did do anything to try and help their children in May 1536. We know that the Westons, Sir Francis Weston's family, appealed to the French ambassador, tried to intervene to stop, tried to offer sort of money to stop their son, being executed. We know that because we've got the records of it. We don't know, we haven't got any records of the Boleyns trying to do anything, but they may have written to Cromwell and the king. We just don't know. We can't say that it didn't happen, but we can say that we don't have evidence of it. But even if they didn't write to Cromwell or the king, that doesn't equal them not caring or loving, for their children. As a courtier, as a man who'd been a royal favourite for so long, as a man who was close to the king, as a loyal servant, Thomas would surely have known that his children had absolutely no chance. He'd seen the falls of people like the Duke of Buckingham, who, had lived at Penshurst close to the Boleyns at Hever. He'd seen people fall like John Fisher, Thomas More. All these people were loyal servants to the king. He'd watched them fall. He'd seen them be imprisoned and executed. He must have known that the fates of his children were a foregone conclusion, that there was nothing that could be done anyway. We have to remember that to the people of the time, to the 16th century people, that the king was God's anointed sovereign. Henry VIII was, by the time that Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn got executed, he was the supreme head of the church in England. He was God's right-hand man in England. He'd been chosen by God to rule the country. That was what people believed in the 16th century. What Henry VIII said and did went, and it was a courtier's job to serve their king loyally and to go along with the decisions he made. Thomas Boleyn was a courtier, he was a diplomat, he was a privy councillor, he was Lord Privy Seal, he was an officer of the king was his master. Like others before him, like other families, all the prominent families that had lost, fathers, sons, and that to the executioner, he had to come to terms with the fact that the king viewed his relatives as traitors, and he had to work hard to demonstrate his loyalty to the king. He had to focus on his surviving family. He had to focus on the future of his granddaughter, Elizabeth. He had to focus on his duty to the king. On the 29th of June 1536, just over a month after the executions of his son and daughter Anne and George, Thomas was stripped of his office of Lord Privy Seal, an office he'd held since January 1530. However, his service to the king during the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion paid off. He was able to sort of get back into royal favour by working hard, by working for the king, by showing his loyalty to the king. He was present at Prince Edward's baptism in October 1537, and by January 1538 he was actively back at court. Now, in April 1538, so just under 2 years after the executions of her children, Elizabeth Boleyn died. She died at the Abbot of Reading's residence near Baynard's Castle in London. I apologise for any squeaking that you can hear. It's my cat meowing at my feet. Elizabeth was buried with members of her family, the Howard family, at Lambeth, at St Mary's Church in Lambeth, which is now the Garden Museum. There's been speculation that the location of her death and the fact that she was buried at Lambeth instead of St Peter's Church, Hever, which is where Thomas Boleyn rests, that is evidence of a breakdown in her relationship with her husband, that it shows that the Boleyns had separated. But there is no evidence of this at all, and you think of the gossip of the Henry VIII's court, the gossip that we find in the Lisle letters, for example, the letters that were written to Lord and Lady Lisle, who were in Calais serving the king. Elizabeth's death is reported in those letters. Her funeral is reported in those letters. You'd think that there'd be some mention of the fact, that, and of course she was separated from her husband, and that, her husband wasn't even there at her death, wasn't there, at her funeral, didn't have anything to do with it or something. You'd think that there'd be some kind of mention, there'd be some kind of gossip about the state of their marriage if they had been separated. We don't know what she was doing in London, and perhaps it was just tradition that as a Howard woman that she would be buried with her family at Lambeth. Now, there's further evidence of Thomas being back in favour with the king following the executions of his children, because by 1538 there were rumours that he was going to marry Margaret Douglas. So his wife died in April 1538, and I think it was by July 1538, just a few months after Elizabeth's death, there were rumours going around that he was going to marry Lady Margaret Douglas, who was Henry VIII's niece. Now, this obviously didn't happen. But you have to be high in favour with the king for this even to be rumoured. I mean, a man who was out of favour with the king and who the king hated and who was completely blackened, surely there wouldn't be rumours that he was going to marry the king's niece. I mean, that shows just what favour Thomas had managed to climb back into. That's reported in a letter to Lady Lisle in July 1538. Thomas died in March 1539, just under a year after his wife. He was laid to rest, as I said, at the parish church at Hever, just outside Hever Castle, the Boleyn family home. Further evidence of the fact that he was back in favour with the king is shown by the fact that King Henry VIII ordered masses to be said for Thomas Boleyn's soul. Now, Elizabeth Boleyn survived Anne and George by just under 2 years. Thomas survived them by just under 3 years. Thomas was about 62 when he died, and his wife was probably around 58. We don't know their birth dates, but that's what we can kind of glean from the records. Those aren't bad ages for Tudor people. I mean, you do see Tudor people living into their 80s, but late 50s, early 60s is not bad for Tudor people, but I do wonder if their health was affected by grief. I mean, it's just hard to imagine what it must be like to have your son and daughter killed in such circumstances, to lose them in that way. Now, whatever your views on Thomas and Elizabeth, this couple lost 2 of their children to the executioner for crimes that they, in all probability, did not commit. Thomas and Elizabeth had to live with the fact that the king they'd served so loyally had executed Anne and George. They had to cope with their family name being dragged through the mud in April and May 1536, and it was ongoing after that. Though, it was said that their daughter had seduced 5 men. She was accused of following daily her frail and carnal appetites. She was accused of seducing her own brother. And Anne and her lovers, including her brother, were accused of trying to kill the king. It was high treason, and it was salacious high treason. The words of the indictments and what Anne did with her her lust, her carnal appetites, it's just horrible. How do you come to terms with that? How do you come to terms with losing your son and daughter? But how do you come to terms with your family name being dragged through the mud like that? And now, today, history is still blackening their names. We still constantly see Thomas Boleyn being described as a pimp. Every time I write about his death in March, every time I do an On This Day in History, Thomas Boleyn died March 1539, I get, karma, a great, he pimped out his daughters to the king. He was responsible for Anne's death, so good. And, Elizabeth Boleyn, we have, the rumours, we have people writing that, oh, yes, didn't she sleep with the king as well? Or she wasn't there for her daughter. They did nothing to help their children in May 1536. History is still blackening their names today, and I find that very, very sad. I'm sitting here thinking about, paying tribute to Anne Boleyn because it's the anniversary of her execution, but I think now is the time to rehabilitate her whole family, her parents, and just to see them as a couple who lost their children, who obviously were then distanced from their granddaughter as well. How could they be involved in Elizabeth's life, now? They were the parents of traitors. And I just find it very, very sad. So on that note, I will leave you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Anne Boleyn Day. Take care. Bye-bye.